So those are the three reasons. I have to, however, say the three lessons come out of it, which I think are strategic for our conversation, which raises tension in some of us. The first is I don't believe young people are always progressive. I think it's a myth. I think this idea that young people always lead progressive struggles around the world is not historically true. Young people led the Chinese Cultural Revolution. It destroyed Chinese society. Walk in Germany and go see who's leading the AfD, or the Le Pen movement in France, or the Five Star movement in Italy, and go see some of the people who were part of the Nigel Farage, this thing, or even some of the Trump movement. These are right-wing fascist movements led by young people as much as by older people. And for me, so this idea, I think that young people are always progressive, is romanticized. Young people have the potential to lead progressive struggle, absolutely. Like they did in Fees Must Fall, like they did in 76, like they did in many other cases. But they have as increased the possibility of leading reactionary struggles, and I think that that's one thing. The second is, don't they talk about young people as a completely homogeneous group. I think that in Fees Must Fall, you were able to align many forces, and I think at the basic level, the vast majority of young people believed in the core principle of Fees Must Fall, which is lowering the cost of higher education and enabling access, that everybody should be, without the cost of problem, should have the right. I think that was across the board. But the imaginaries of the future, young people are a plural group. There are multiple imaginaries, some of which come into tension with each other and disagree with each other in fundamental ways. And that's the thing that I think is quite striking, and that young people need, at least we need to capture in this thing. And then the final thing, which I think is important, Fees Must Fall and Fees Must Fall activists were, I think, brilliant at describing pain, society's pain. And I think they did a powerful job of bringing this and putting it onto the national agenda. They have not been as successful in imagining how you transcend pain. Because that is about confronting power. It's about confronting, transforming power. It's about the strategies and tactics of how you outcome. And there, I think they've been less successful. I think the suggestions made are sometimes not as innovative, not as strategic, not as understanding of the failures and successes of past strategies. And so capturing and describing pain, I think, is a powerful imaginary that has been put on the national agenda, would never have happened without Fees Must Fall. Transcending it is, I think, a debate that still needs to happen, and it can only happen if we are honest about the successes and failures of the last couple of years.
Great and interesting opening thoughts from our panelists. I think I want to get a follow-up and a response, Wandile, to some of the points which Adam has raised about the lessons, particularly for students, for young people, and whether they're homogenous or not, that young people have not always been progressive. And I also want to follow up on the location of these protests. The mere fact, which both Adam and Loveland have mentioned, that they happened at historically white universities, and the issues that it raises about class, and the fact that it was able to then go on and dominate headlines was because it took place at these particular locations. And the question I would like to explore is what that tells us about South Africa. What do we care about? Whose voices matter in that particular instance? I want to firstly, I'll get your response to Adam's opening statement.
So, Prof, I've said before, you must be careful of comparing people you don't disagree with to dictators, because when Ego did something similar, you nearly expelled them from this. I mean, we are not a homogeneous group. Of course, we have many different, I guess, struggles within ourselves as young people. The very fact that the movement itself, I guess, blew up at WITS does not mean everyone at WITS is middle class. It means that there were many voices there, but they found one common, I guess, a common idea in which to communicate. And I mean, it is. So Roads Must Fall begins. Roads Must Fall does not continue as long as it was supposed to, because it was talking about ideology and theory, decolonization. It's difficult to kind of have that type of movement become a national one in which Fees Must Fall was, because Fees Must Fall, we're talking about money. We are talking about izinto. What am I eating? What am I wearing? You can see that. And it affects the middle class. This is why I guess it blew up at adverts, because the middle class parents, or I guess families, kind of realize, you know what, now we can't afford fees because of, I guess, the economic problems that from 2008 until 2015. So when the middle class speak in South Africa, I guess we listen. We listen. It's not a good thing. The voices that need to be listened to, of course, are the poor voices, but the middle class kind of has a monopoly on being a dominant voice in the country. I mean, the location itself. Oh no! So the Fees Must Fall, the movement. It was. I think we must. It wasn't new, of course. So it was struggles that had begun many years before. I've traced, actually, I think I've to even 1994. I mean, these issues were happening at later 94. Issues of access, transformation. Back then, it wasn't colonization; it was transformation. So it was there, and it comes over the years. And I mean, in 1994, it actually made headlines also. So it's always been the dominant, historically white universities that then, I guess, become in the media. And then my question then becomes, if, I guess, Professor Habib agrees with the movement and sees the movement as something that needed to happen, when he comes into a university like Wits as a new vice chancellor, Black, I guess, knowing very well his struggles as fighting for transformation in his former years as an academic and in other universities. Why does it take so long, and why is it so difficult for him to kind of make the changes that need to be made? I mean, so he came in, and if he says he agrees and he knows that and I think he did know that this was going to happen, but why was there no pressure from vice chancellors to governments? I mean, they remove themselves totally from the story. They don't see themselves as people who are at fault. So those are some of the questions I have. Is that these are Black university vice chancellors. They occupy this position. They themselves, as junior academics, used to fight for transformation. And then when they have this power, and students, I guess, are questioning them, they see it as an attack on them and not on the system. Because they inherit the system and they don't change the system, and it takes too long. And then they say we must go to government as students, when I think it should actually be them who would have put the pressure and who had access to ministers of higher education better than us over years, and they didn't do that. So yeah, those are my reflections on that.
All right, we'll get Adam a chance to respond to that. But one of the points which was made earlier, Adam suggested that one of the things in which students were so brilliant at is describing the pain. And I think one of the reasons that the movement and its struggle did in fact resonate to the extent that it did is because it threw up so many issues which South Africans were confounded with, and primarily around institutionalized racism and the protracted and structural inequality in South Africa. And young people were able to articulate that in such sharp and fresh ways that it captivated the imagination of many South Africans. I'm going to quote a line here, Loveland, for you to respond to and think about, which is in the book, We Are No Longer These. It's a line from Sarah's essay, and she's talking about this, and she says, as women, we are constantly on the opposite side of either a penis or a gun, oftentimes both. And reflecting on some of the misogyny and patriarchy which played out within the movement during those protests. What was your experience during that time?
Okay. There's a lot. I want to answer your question, but I also want to respond to some of the earlier comments. So, I mean, I think just to address the question of gender and sexuality within the movement. So, I think this was one of those opportunities to observe how young people are not a homogeneous group, and where in many ways, you know, your politics was constantly being challenged. So even if we were mobilizing around the question of fees, part of what happened in a lot of you know, plenary spaces, if I can call them that, was you know, a lot of us calling for us to actually practice the kind of politics we want to see in this world that we're trying to create, right? And so there was a lot of tension around, you know, how men were behaving within the space, how cisgendered heterosexual people behaving within the space. There was a lot of questions that were raised about that. And I mean, I think in many ways there are parallels to draw from what happened during the liberation struggle, right, in this country. That it was, no, we need to fight apartheid and we need to deal with racism, and then after 94 we'll talk about gender, you know, but right now let's just, you know, focus on this one thing. And so I think that in some circles there was an attempt to create this false dichotomy between, you know, the question of fees, higher education, access and affordability, and trying to separate that from other issues and other you know, experiences that are connected to that on campus, but maybe play out on the stage that, you know, of gender or sexuality. So one of the things that I think happened on quite a few campuses, I mean, I can only speak from my experience in Stellenbosch and some of my own engagements with fellow students at UWC, CPUT and UCT, because we didn't have that many Black people in the Western Cape, so we all had to sort of mobilize across our different campuses and physically go and support on other campuses. But I think that one of the things that was very evident was that the women students were oftentimes the ones doing a lot of the groundwork, doing a lot of the on-the-ground organizing, mobilizing, doing a lot of the actual shutting down of buildings, occupying buildings or blocking roads, things like that. So a lot of us were the ones on the ground doing the organizing, and then when the cameras appeared, suddenly the male comrades were available for comment with the media. So that happened in a lot of cases, and I think that you know, I mean, I'm being a bit frivolous about it, but it's not to say that the competition was about who got to be in front of the media. It's more a question about how the narrative around that then becomes, oh, this is the face of Fees Must Fall, right? Or these are the faces of Fees Must Fall. And those faces then, and those voices were typically voices that, you know, that were male. And so I think that what you may have noticed over the time of Fees Must Fall was that, you know, there was a saying that kept going around: this movement will be intersectional or it will be bullshit. Sorry for my French, but you know, I'm just speaking history here. So that was one of the things that kept going around. This movement is going to be intersectional, it's not going to be at all. And what that meant was that I think for a lot of us, we were saying that, you know, and even me, you know, I'm not interested in a liberated future if that means that, you know, only Black men are liberated. And I don't say that to pit us against each other. I'm just saying that there is a particular experience of exclusion, there's a particular experience of violence and a particular experience of who is violatable that comes with actively being involved and actively laying your body down within the movement. And so there were quite a few circumstances, I think, where a lot of women students and queer students as well actually chose to sabotage the movement. And not sabotage it as in we don't want the movement to succeed, but that if you're not going to take our concerns seriously, then we're going to tap out. And so there were a few cases where the women students had organized and were like, okay, well, unless we address this, we can't continue in this conversation, or we can't continue in this mobilization. And I think sometimes it worked and sometimes it didn't. So I don't want to misrepresent it and act like there was one perfect strategy for addressing that. And then I think we also saw the use of naked protest during the Fees Must Fall protest, but I guess there was it sort of attached itself with the End Rape Culture protests at Stellenbosch, the RU reference list protests at the university currently known as Rhodes, where female students were protesting naked, both to protest the way in which male colleagues were treating them in protest spaces, but also to protest issues of sexual harassment and rape on campus, issues of police brutality, and all of that was part of a bigger and a broader conversation. And so, there were certain spaces and conversations where people opted to step back because they felt that their experience was being ignored. If I may, just very quickly, Sis Nikiwe, I just want to address some of the questions that Prof raised. So I mean, I think I don't really think it's a real tension, this question of homogeneity. I think we're all aware of that, and I think we owned that in many ways during the protests. But I do want to challenge this notion that students are brilliant at describing pain, but they weren't so good at transcending it, or providing alternatives or communicating solutions, etc., etc. I really want to challenge that idea, and I think it goes back to this question of what gets us to listen as South Africans. Who are we listening to? Why are we listening to those voices? Where are those voices? And so the one thing that I do want to say is that this is a narrative, and this is a narrative that I've been hearing a lot. And no offense, Prof, but I hear it from people from your generation, and it irks me. It irks me because I feel like, I'm hearing this narrative that makes it look like, it was a protest where we were performing pain, and then it was empty, like there was nothing going on between our heads about what we were actually asking for and what we were looking for. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the generation that helped get us to 1994 had not really experienced such a severe challenge from the people that they were delivering 1994 to or for. Narratives about liberation, and who gets to own narratives about what meaning making is, what solution making is, what it looks like, what it sounds like. But even if that's not true, so let's say that's not what is going on, and let's say that really there is a lack of solutions from students. Firstly, there were multiple papers, like multiple academic papers, multiple conferences, multiple opinion pieces, multiple submissions made to Parliament, multiple submissions given to the department. Like, on so many levels, there was so much material that was created by students, sometimes in partnership with academics at our institutions who were supporting the movement, where we presented alternative models for funding higher education, where we did case studies from different countries, thought about different ways of funding education, thought about, asking questions about why corporate tax is at 28% and it's okay for corporates to, send billions and billions offshore every year, and yet you're asking universities to carry such a heavy financial burden, and you're asking ordinary citizens to carry such heavy financial burdens in the form of VAT, in the form of personal income tax, etc., etc. There are actual economic models that students did work of creating and submitted those far and wide. There's a pamphlet that I can't remember the name of, and I'm wondering if there's any students here who can remember it, but there was a pamphlet that was even being circulated in our communities, at least in Cape Town, where we had presented various models, various conversations about decolonization, what the future can look like, etc. There was also submissions made by students about this question of Pan-Africanism within our institutions, because as we know, other African students who come to study at our institutions mostly have to pay their fees up front, or they pay like way more than the average student pays. And so students also made submissions. I remember at Stellenbosch we made a submission proposing alternative funding models for other students from Africa as part of this question of Pan-Africanist solidarity and interrogating why South African institutions are imbibing these notions of colonial borders. There were submissions that were made around how we can teach in our classrooms, ways of reimagining the curriculum, not just of theoretically what can the curriculum look like, but students made submissions at their various departments, at their various institutions around what we would like to be taught, how we'd like to be taught, different platforms, different ways, different sites where learning can take place. But I think the challenge is that when these submissions were being made, the media was not there, because the media was drawn to moments when we were blocking the roads, right? So that they were drawn to a spectacle so that they could perpetuate this narrative of ungrateful Black children who are so privileged to be at university, and now they're protesting and making a noise and blocking the roads and, creating traffic, and they're being violent, etc., etc., etc. So the media was drawn to moments when there was a spectacle, when there was something to report on. But when we make submissions, when we write articles, when we submit academic papers, when we're doing presentations, there's no cameras there, right? And so there's also something to be said about how the entire machinery of power and the entire machinery of managing narratives was actually very strategic and intentional about the kind of narrative that's going to be put out. I mean, we're university students. So if we're university students engaging in protest, best believe that there is something theoretical, there's something academic and intellectual about what we're doing. Right. So I really want to dispel this narrative, and I think we've got to engage that. So, sorry, last thing. So even if we think about who the students are, the former students are now, who are actively involved in academia, who themselves are teaching, who themselves are writing, who themselves are doing PhDs differently and doing their research differently. It's disingenuous to say that students were so good at articulating pain, but they weren't so good at providing solutions. The issue is that the media was very good at covering the spectacles of pain, but they were not interested in actually showing students who were rational, who were in sit-ins, who were in lectures, educating each other, educating the lecturers, lecturers educating us. They weren't interested in those platforms, and I think we've got to own that.
Even if you don't like the story, it's useful to read it. For one simple reason, if you know why people act the way they do, the next time you're in a struggle, you can at least anticipate that action and counteract it in the ways you need to. So there's a value simply by reading it, by learning what forced us to make the kinds of decisions we did. So that's the first thing that I want to say. Let me respond to the actual questions. First is that vice chancellors actually never confronted government. This is just not true. I think it's legitimate to say we were not successful in confronting government. And the big question is why we're not successful. So for 5 or 8 years, there were repeated attempts by vice chancellors saying, we're heading for a crisis in higher education. In fact, if any of you Google, you will see 2 weeks before, actually fees must fall erupted at WITS. I was representing vice chancellors in a public engagement with the president, President Zuma then, where actually he says that the vice chancellor is saying we are going to head for a major crisis in January 2016. We miscalculated. And there's going to be a huge eruption, and that actually we want some interventions. That we were intervening with banks and saying, here's the choices that we're heading for, here's the crisis, here are possible solutions. Now you might not agree with the solutions, but what you have to say is that it's not true that vice chancellors were not engaging. The question the book asks is why were we failed and students in 10 days won exactly what we were debating for 10 years? And the answer to that is the students were prepared to take to the streets when vice chancellors were not. That's what the book answers. And it says that's the one lesson that you should learn. And I've said this before. Students achieved in 10 days in 2015 what vice chancellors had been debating for 10 years. So it's not true that we were not doing anything. What is true is that we were not successful, whereas the students were, and the lessons that were learned. The second is why were we not transforming fast enough? Now, frankly, here I do think there is a debate to be had. Because it is not true that our institutions haven't transformed. They may have not transformed as fast enough as you appreciate. But to argue that it's not transformed is actually empirically incorrect. And frankly, some universities have done better than others. So, at the moment, Witz's University, student numbers are 82% black. Now, you might say, that's not great. But when you compare in Stellenbosch, it's 65% white. Actually, we were ahead of curve. I know I shouldn't be talking about other institutions, but I think in an honest conversation, when people say that your administration hasn't changed, 86% of our administrators are black. Now you might say, but your academics haven't changed. Actually, for the first time, our academics in 2018 shifted to 51% black. Now, if you go back to 1994, we were 90% white. Don't tell me we have not changed. We might not have changed as far as we should have. That's a legitimate thing. You could argue we could have been done better. That's an argument to be had. But frankly, to argue that no change has happened, here's what I do say. And when I came in 2013, I'm using the example of this. I was worried about a very simple thing. I'll be honest with you, as a black vice chancellor. The feeling was that WITS was losing its space. That it was no longer as good as it was in the late 1980s. And frankly, the hidden conversation was, as it was transforming, it's losing its quality. And I said, in the next 5 years, we're going to prove we can be both black and research intensive. We're going to have higher throughput, better research, more innovation, and we're going to be more transformed. And in those indicators of higher throughput, we're 70% up in research. Last year we produced 9,500 graduates. We overtook UCT in the Shanghai rankings in 2016. Hadn't happened for 20 years. Why was that important? Was to change a narrative in our society that said, the more you transform, the weaker you become. And we changed that. And that was the lesson that we were going out with. Now, let me tell you the hard things. So, let's talk about the alternatives. Because I did say, actually, that we describe pain better, but we don't let our understand it. So the book takes all of the student cases and alternatives, and I put it in the book. Here's what they argue, here's their solutions, and here's why it won't work. I give you numbers, I give you detail. So for instance, I take actual numbers. Yes, some academics and some students did a modeling exercise. And they said, actually, the way you could move and fund higher education is by thinking about a graduate tax. I do the numbers. To free higher education we need an extra 140 billion a year. Extra every year. The graduate tax at 1% gives you 2 billion. At 2% gives you 4 billion. That's not even 10% of coming through the numbers. I go through why each explanation will not work. In curriculum reform, I did the same thing. I said where ideas are useful. Brian Kamanzi actually had proposed a series of ideas around engineering, and I said, here is why I think it's useful. And here's other ideas why I think they're wrong. And I don't think they understand the complexity of it. I think many student activists confused the university with a political school. They didn't realize that there's a complexity to the curriculum. I had engagements with students, SRC members, who said to me, actually we don't want to learn neoclassical economics. We only want to learn Marxist economics. And I said, you can't learn Marxist economics if you don't learn neoclassical economics. They were ideas that were useful, and frankly there were a lot of ideas that were very weak. And actually you can't discuss this in the abstract. So you have to take case by case. Let's look at the case. And that's what the book does. I have up to today, this book is out for 4 months. I haven't had a student come to me and say, here's why you're wrong with what you argued there. They make the generic argument. You're not fair. You've accused us of being dictators. You made us this. But no one's taken the argument where I took. I said I'm going to take student demand seriously. And therefore, look at the case and say why it won't work. There hasn't been a single case. I didn't only do it for students. I did it for academics and said why this will work and why this won't work. Finally. And I can debate every one of those cases. Finally, are there lessons from fees must fall? I think they are. I'll give you 5, which I think are important. 1, I think there is no doubt if you want to advance social justice, the one singular positive lesson is social mobilization is important. You can talk as much as you want. It makes a big difference if you put 20,000 people on the street. I think that there's no denying that. It's quite clear. Second, I think when you put people down on the street, it doesn't have to be violent. When you become violent, I think it works to the disadvantage of the movement. Because what you do is you fracture support, people stop supporting you, and you force decision makers to act in ways that can break that movement. And so tactically, I think social mobilization and rage is important. I think violence is not. And the book makes that case. Third, I make the argument that factionalization movements are dangerous. When you mobilize across class and across race, it's in your interest because it falls in the strategy of the 80s. Unite the forces for the change, don't divide it. Because when you divide it, you allow the opposite side to do it. I think that's there. And then finally, I think there's a lesson about how you practice what you preach. I give many examples about leadership, students and others, by the way, academics, who say one thing in the public and they do other things in the private. I give multiple examples of this. I think you can't talk about progressive struggle, complain about the political elite and their failures, and then live exactly and practice a politics exactly like that. And again, I give multiple examples. Now, if you differ with me, that's okay. But it seems to me that we have to confront those debates if you want to win future struggles. And that's the point, ultimately, that this book is about.
I think it's great that we have an opportunity to look at both of these books and that there is a diversity of views and plurality of voices as we continue to reflect on the moment of Fees Must Fall and what it tells us about South Africa and the meanings which we draw. I want to talk about the power of language. One always says, of course, you can't judge a book by its cover, but the titles here are very, very interesting. We Are No Longer at Ease, and Rebels and Rage. I'm interested in finding out what thought process went into deciding what you would call the books, or you're one of the editors of that, And also what we as observers, as South Africans and people who want to understand broadly about South African society and the challenges it faces, what this book, this collection of writings, essays, reflections, poems, what it tells us about that moment, what we can learn, and how it can help us, I suppose, heal the wounds of the past, which of course is a critical component of what we do here at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, and why you chose print as a way to archive this particular moment.
So we named it "We Are No Longer at Ease" because I guess it comes from a place where young people are saying, listen, we were told we were free, and we were supposed to be free. We were supposed to have an easy way through life. Everything was supposed to, the Constitution, the preamble talks about equal opportunities for everyone. And all of a sudden, I'm saying this for the sake, all of a sudden, these very young people are the ones that are standing up and saying, hey, hold on, we are not free. So this is why we named this book, We Are No Longer at Ease. We can't, the way in which we have been silent, it cannot go on. We are now saying it's our time now to speak. We were intentional about being or having as many voices as possible and using different types of I guess communication. We have poetry, we have pictures, we have essays, we have academic and personal essays, because in the movement itself we communicated differently. So I'm very interested in the idea of different types of protest. You don't need to be on a stage speaking to students to be a leader. You can be doing other things. You can, like as Lavin was saying, women were doing the groundwork. They are as much credible as Mcebo Dlamini in being part of them. So we were trying to kind of do that, to kind of capture the, I guess, the variety of voices and different experiences and different modes of communication. We used a book, I guess, because that's one way of making sure you archive, and a book is an archive that lasts longer. It lasts long, and it is able to, I guess, you can be able to challenge it 10 years from now. You can be able to come back and say, hey, listen, maybe these were ideas that were spoken about long ago. I think if those who were protesting in 1994 were writing, we would have had an archive as well of how to protest and how to do things. As Adam says, I guess in a previous engagement, he said he didn't agree with the way in which we protested because we were not listening to their advice, for example, but they hadn't written anything. And I mean, so we must engage on those levels as well, in saying in whatever we are doing now, whatever mistakes we have. We never said our movement was 100% correct. We made many mistakes, but in making our mistakes were our mistakes, and we are honest about them, and we are able to communicate them. What the vice chancellors are failing to do is to actually come up and say, listen, we might have made mistakes here. Perhaps if we agreed with you guys so much on these issues, we shouldn't have had police come on campus. We shouldn't have spent a cent of money on private security. You see, these are, I guess, the kinds of engagement that a book offers. I guess his book as well. It offers us an insider perspective in how vice chancellors were thinking and how they were imagining our movement to be. On one side they say it was good, on the other they say the leaders themselves were not credible leaders, and we were, I guess, protesting incorrectly. And I don't agree with them wanting to tell us. I mean, elders as well. I mean, even my parents at home, we disagree on these issues a lot. but we must also have space as a generation to make our own mistakes. We can be told that, okay, maybe you can't protest like this is a democracy, but if the violence in which has been meted out against us as young people, I guess warrants a type of response, then who are you to kind of, then I become angry when you tell me how to communicate my feelings or my frustrations about how society is structured. Yeah, I mean, Loveland, do you want to say something?
Yes, I do want your views on this, Loveland, because you also contributed to this book, and I think I'm trying to understand what motivated people to make those contributions. What lessons did you want people to learn about the movement for future generations as well, in terms of determining that your side of the story was it heard? Has it been heard? There have been a plethora of work coming out about Fields Must Fall in different formats, different medium. Whether it's been documentary film or academic text or poetry, as Wandile has said, which is the most effective, I suppose, vessel and tool in which to capture that story? And as a contributor, how do you think that's worked out?
So I think in terms of the book, We Are No Longer at Ease, I think for a lot of us that did contribute, you'll see some of those contributions are quite dated in terms of the time when the book came out and when those contributions were actually written. And there were some of us for whom writing in a reflection about Fees Must Fall felt a bit too soon. And it felt too soon on the one hand because a lot of us were still deeply traumatized by what had happened on our campuses, by the way in which we were treated, by the ways in which we felt violated on multiple levels, and also by the kinds of responses that were given to us. So I think it's important to say that it wasn't, a group of people who were on standby ready to comment. For a lot of us, it was very difficult, it was very personal, and I think that's what makes that compilation of essays both profound and problematic at the same time. You know what I mean? Problematic in that, it's a lot of it is personal reflections on the journey, but profound in the sense that, oh, okay, you guys actually have something to say, So that's something I do want to say. I don't think that there's a best way of reflecting or archiving or keeping record. I don't think that there's a best way. I think that in the same way that the systems of oppression that have us where we are today were total in nature, I think we've got to also be total, if I can put it that way, in terms of how we reflect. So we have Twitter today. I mean, if you just do a search of #FeesMustFall, Twitter itself is a living sort of contemporary archive and things will come up. If you search for online articles, you'll find there was plays that were done. Quite a few of the drama departments across the country did plays about it. So there's so many different ways in which we thought of memorializing. Yes? Hey guys, English is not my another time, man. And it's a weekend, so my English reserves are very low. They're depleted, but I mean, so I think there were different ways that people, chose to archive and to remember Fees Must Fall. And I think that's, something that even just for me on a personal level, it's something I'm still grappling with, because I've also felt I do have a question about, what it means to record certain things in print, and how that in itself is exclusionary in a way, And I say that as someone who is a scholar, who loves knowledge, who reads, who loves reading. But I also understand that there's a very, capturing knowledge in written form can be very restricting and can be very limiting in that sense. So it is something that I'm personally grappling with, and then also grappling with the style of personal reflection. Because again, if we want to talk about the politics of the movement and what it means to situate certain narratives in individual terms, when it was a collective and broad-based effort. There's some politics around that. The other thing that I wanted to say was, so just to say, I haven't read Prof. Habib's book. And in fact, my coming here today would have been as an audience member, and this was going to be his audition to convince me to actually buy his book. So I haven't read your book, but I did listen to your first interview with Eusebius when you were unpacking it on radio. So I had come in here with quite a few questions, and now I've got to actually say things and sound profound. But I do want to say that you know, there's something you said now that, you know, that the vice chancellors had previously been engaging in, and I know that our vice chancellors had been involved in a few conversations with government about this. But you know, in another way, there's a part of me that feels like you, as our vice chancellors, were not the people we should have been struggling against. You know what I mean? You shouldn't have been the people that we were struggling against, and I say that because
yes, yeah. Teach.
Sorry. I recognize, sorry, I'm going to push through. So I recognize that there is, there's a complexity that comes with, you know, with the journey of struggle. I recognize that. And I recognize that our elders are carrying many wounds and many scars and many decisions and choices that they have to make, right? And I recognize that when you reach a certain level of authority in the society, this is what you fought for. You fought for us to be able to sit here and talk and argue like this, right? You fought for these freedoms. So I recognize that when we reach a point where we are in a society where, you know, our elders are occupying these positions of authority, that even in those positions, there's a complexity that you're sitting with, right? And yet at the same time, for me, what I really struggled with during Fees Must Fall, post Fees Must Fall, is what to me in some ways felt like a co-optation of our elders, right? That you sort of, you know, you were the radicals and the rebels with the rage, you know, and now you're co-opted in various ways. And so to even ask the question of why did it take us 10 years and why did it take you 10 years, I feel like that's a question you should look in the mirror and ask. And I don't mean to say this to be disrespectful to you. This is part of, I mean, those who've been with me this week have heard me say this 50 times. But this is, for me, a broader conversation about intergenerational solidarity and the chasm that exists between our generation and the previous generation, who really gave us a lot to get us to this point. But also it feels like we keep talking past each other because in many ways you are so deeply invested in this system and you are so deeply invested in the various ways in which the system oppresses us. So it does feel like a bit of a I don't want to say a family fight because that makes it seem frivolous, but it feels like we're missing each other on many levels. And so when we engage in questions of transformation, you know, I feel like I get frustrated when I hear, oh, we have 82% black, we have 100% black. I'm like, this is part of the lie of post-apartheid South Africa, that transformation is a question of just add blacks and stir, or add women and stir, you know, as Panache Chidumanzi talks about it. Like, this is the lie, right? Because if we really want to be honest, transformation isn't just about having black bodies or women or queer bodies in a space. That's not what transformation is about. If that's what it was about, then we can say we've always been transformed. We've always been in this country. Transformation is a question of how you are transforming what is normal in certain spaces. It's a question of engaging the colonial logic that says there is an other and there is the person that belongs. There is something that is normal and there is something that is abnormal. And in our context, even being black in a WITS, in a UCT or whatever, even being black in those spaces means we are abnormal, right? Even being black in those spaces means that our forms of cultural expression, our intellectual knowledge, our intellectual contributions are considered abnormal. They are considered outside the frame of that which is worth teaching, of that which is worth knowing, of that which is worth recognizing. And so for me, it's that this is what happened to us as the ex-Model C kids. Oh no, now you can all go to school together, you can share toilets with white children, you can be taught in the same schools, but what you're being taught encourages your oppression. It encourages you being on the sidelines, right? And that's why we have this book that just came out now of the academics at higher institutions of higher education who are writing about what it means to be black in institutions, even where the student body is majority black, because it's not about adding the bodies, it's about the logic of those institutions transforming, right? And this is part of what's happened with the South African state, is the fact that all that happened after 1994 was that you just got a black emperor at the head of the table, but the institution, the way in which those institutions are set up to operate are still inherently anti-black and anti-women. So it's not so much just a question of putting bodies in a place. It's important because representation, we need that. But it's also about saying, so now that these bodies are in this space, how does existence in this space get changed? How does value in this space get transformed? And that's what makes it easy to then default to a conversation about violence. Because before we get to a conversation about who's on the streets, who's protesting, who's being violent, we've got to be willing to talk about what forms of violence actually are, right? Because for me, and I just want to put it out, I've experienced enough violence in my own personal life that it will be very difficult for you to see me acting in a violent way, as in physically harming someone or physically harming a building, right? But I will say that I can understand 100%, right, why it's difficult for us as young people to engage this conversation about violence when our poverty, when our struggles, when epistemic violence doesn't feature in these conversations. We don't want to talk about structural violence. So the only violence you see is burning tires, and that becomes violence. But everything that gets you to the point of burning a tire doesn't count as violence. I'm not trying to have that conversation. I'm sorry.
So we are now going to open it up to our audience, just to let you know that. But we are going to open it up to our audience now because we are running out of time. One of the considerations is that Adam has to leave here at 3:45, so please be mindful of that. And we're now going to open it up to the floor, and we will have another contribution towards the end, which is also from the book, and we'll have a recital of a poem that's included here by one of the contributors, Hanns Seidel Foundation, who's also with us today. And do remember, of course, that the book is on sale, and that will be outside. Is it, Wandile? Right, excellent. So let's open it up to our audience. If you could please raise your hand, identify yourself, and let us know to whom you are posing your question. And if we could be quite concise, because time is of the essence, we'll start there and over there. Do we have a roving microphone available for that?
I don't fear anything, but microphones just kind of freak me out. They're so intimidating. My name is Andy. I'm with human rights educator with Amnesty International, amongst other NGOs. I've made a few notes only because I'm so passionate about this subject, and I may waffle on, so I try to just keep it in context. Firstly, Professor, you said that young people are not progressive. The question that I've always had is, as more elderly people, are we providing them with not enough support to be progressive? Who has defined progressive? Have they defined what progressive means to them, or have we just described what progressive means to us? A lot of times I find in my engaging with youth on subjects of education that education, you only thought of as an educated person if you go to a traditional institution, and not everybody has access to a traditional institution. So I think this notion of even with the Fields Must Fall organization and movement, pushing only for students to go to universities or institutions, for me somehow it's not the end goal. You know, it's apart from everything falling, what must we build? What can we look forward to? So there's job creation. There's a problem. People want to be part of the economics. When I talk to youth these days, none of them are telling me I want to go to university. All they're telling me is I want to make the money. How can I make the money? You know, what can you teach me? So real world solutions. I grew up in Everton next to Wilberforce College, the Teachers College. The struggle then was against collapsing the regime, and especially Afrikaans. And I don't think we're progressing beyond that. Our struggles are still against education systems, and it shouldn't be. I mean, even in the US, people are paying bribes to get into universities.
All right, Andy, are you done?
I just have one more thing. I find it very difficult dealing with academics and politicians in South African context. I had the privilege of interviewing Albie Sachs last week. We talked about social mobilization, which I completely agree with. 9 million supporters around the world with Amnesty International. Greta is the young girl, she's 15 years old, who's been fighting for climate change. And she's had one heck of a following. In South Africa, we don't listen to our youth because we feel that they do not have a voice until they go to institutions. So that's my last bit of statement.
Thank you, Andy. Could you pass the microphone on to them?
Good afternoon. My name is August Hofatso Mudiga. I'm 19 years of age and I'm a founder of a non-profit organization for girls and women. And during the Fees Must Fall generation, I was in high school, so I was an observer. I was, very knowledgeable about what was happening. Now that I'm in an institution, I think we haven't touched on the topic of confronting power. He touched on it a bit, but we didn't come up with a solution as to how we deal with confronting power. All these institutions and the corporates that have the solution that we seek. I mean, I think in the conversation of change, we should also talk about how change is received, how change is approached. And I think that is usually the argument from the corporates and the institutions which we seek change from. So I think it's the biggest question. How do we tackle confronting power, the people who are able to bring change in the institution?
Thanks, Augustine. There was a question to the far right of the room. Thank you. Please go ahead.
I'm Koketso Moeti. So I suppose 3 parts. This is for Prof. Habib. There was an open letter that was written to you by some academics, and it was written to basically readers of the book, right? And they mentioned very specific incidences that, that are incorrect and so on. But I think what they raise is so much deeper. They begin the letter by talking about how you write the book as a subjective book, but then you also talk about it as historically accurate. And this is someone whose position of power as well, should be considered in this. And so I think there's a whole set of questions and specifics they go into that speak to you are a person in your position who holds both formal authority due to your position, but also informal, a lot of informal authority due to who you are in our society, right? And how you used that power in the book, whether naming staff members, whether naming students, the perspectives you came, and also just to Wandeli's point about using labels around people you disagree with. They also specifically, you did this in a radio interview, but they also specifically mentioned an incident where there was a call to review the bonuses of executives, and you call a staff member cheeky and insolent. So I'd just be keen to hear a response from you about some of these.
Thanks, Koketso. Is there another question? Do you have a microphone?
Hi, my name is Mduduzi Vilagas. Just have a question for Habib in terms of lessons of Fees Must Fall. He said it's important to mobilize society, but and as the lady was saying, that he sits in a position of power, and you guys have been able to speak to government. You've seen that there were no results. Fees Must Fall happened. Then there were a bit of results, and you're giving us the lessons. Why aren't you guys then continuing it? Because you're in a position of power, and all of you, if you unite and start this and mobilize us, surely we'll join you. And surely other students can come up with solutions that can help in terms of being behind you guys and making sure that South Africa tends to become what it needs to be. And you do speak of transformation and everything that is happening, so you are well aware of our issues. Join. Because now the thing is, everyone here who's speaking, it's almost like we are in different sides. Youth, adults, let's all unite and let's solve South Africa. We can't be stopped. Now the president is Ramaphosa, but Ramaphosa will listen to you and us if we do unite. Let us do it. Why aren't we doing it? Thank you.
Right. I think we'll take one more question here.
So my heart started beating really fast when Prof was talking about violence. So we just came back from the Apartheid Museum, and P.W. Botha sort of talks of he'll only let Mandela out if he denounces violence. Yeah. And then immediately after, you see images of the army, the South African Defence Force, occupying the townships, right? So literally this dissonance that you have. So to talk about the violence of the students in similar ways that Loveland is talking about, I want to know what's been done to deal with the trauma that the students experience at the hands of the private securities that were put at the universities. And I think as an ongoing project, right? Like the images when you watch Riyad Desai's documentary, I was in tears to think Black parents are okay with violating Black children like that. And how that's not at the center of this conversation is also concerning for me. So what's been put in place in terms of dealing with that trauma on an ongoing basis?
My original title of that book was different, actually. Actually, it wasn't my title, it was my wife's title. And she suggested that the title should be At My Wit's End, which I thought was really cute and captured it. But the publishing house rejected the title. Jonathan Ball said that it didn't capture from a marketing point of view, it didn't achieve its ends. And so we eventually retreated to Rebels in Rage. And there's good reasons for why we eventually went there. So that's the first thing I wanted to say, that these things are sometimes by accident, sometimes by negotiation, etc. The second point I wanted to say is, why did I write the book? And why, when I figured that out, I also wanted to answer two questions in that answer. One was the naming question. Why did I name individuals? Why did I articulate this? It might sound odd, but in 2015 and 2016, my concern was that actually the public narrative was not capturing the real debate around this. It had romanticized the struggle and hadn't understood the complexity of the issues around it. And so in a sense, if you pass me the book, I want to tell you that this book, in its first line, captures the dilemma that this book is about. And really, that's what I wanted to bring here. And it says, we are haunted executive at Wits University, haunted by the fear that we will not rise to the strategic challenge of our era. We do not have the ideological comfort of those at the barricades where there is a certainty in the critique. Neither do we have the emotional serenity of the mainstream corporate executive who is comfortable with the world as it is. Instead, we occupy a lonely netherworld where we recognize that things can and must change, yet we have to operate within the financial and political constraints of the present. That was why this book was written. Because I was by historical accident, in a particular moment. For the entire period, for 8 to 10 years before, I said that we were going to actually implode at the universities. In fact, the myth of the Rainbow Nation is something that I wrote in an article in 1996, 1 year after the transition, saying that the terms of this transition is actually wrong. And it's going to create an implosion that is going to create the contradictions of our society. The irony is, I found myself managing that very contradictions 12 years later. And so in a sense, this book is about how do you respond in that historical moment, where you think that the issues and the struggle is legitimate. But you also have to ensure that that struggle evolves in a way that doesn't destroy the institution. Because my belief is if we do destroy these institutions, there shall be no inclusion. Down the line, there shall be no inclusion. That these institutions need to survive. And that's the fundamental reason for writing the book. It's why I take the student alternative so seriously. And why I say, here's what you say, here's the logic of what you say, and here's why you're wrong, or here's why you're right. I devote an entire chapter to transformation and decolonization. I write about what I put forward in 2014 in a document on how you do this, an 8-point plan, about institutional culture, about institutional marginalization, and what you need to do, what worked and what didn't. So I take all of these things seriously. Now, the other thing is, ironically, most people don't. There's not many vice chancellors who write. There's not many vice chancellors who come here and have this conversation. I do, because I actually think it's important. Then actually, by coming here, I respect the right of struggle and the respect of your right to articulate. But actually, what I'm also saying is you make mistakes. And you can either listen to me or not. But here's what my take is. And if you learn, if you take those lessons, that's your right. If you decide not to, that's also your right. But I'm putting that forward because I was in that discourse in a particular moment. I'll tell you this. I make it very clear in the book. Do we have structural violence in our society? Yes, obviously. But I do not believe that you can say because we have structural violence, we can actually engage in individual acts of violence. I think if we allow that, you will destroy the very fabric of our society. We are a very violent society in everyday life. You can't say, we don't like violent crimes, but violent protest is somehow legitimate because it's against structural violence. It doesn't work like this. If you legitimize violence in one aspect of life, you legitimize it in another. I look at those solutions about structural violence. I wrote a whole book in 2012 about how I think you could do it. What are the lessons to be done? You see, I think the real question is I think it's August. What you raised is how do you transform a society? What are the trade-offs in a society? What trade-offs you make and what trade-offs you don't? Because actually, societies, struggles with good intentions have imploded societies. Look what happened in Venezuela. Look what had happened in the Chinese Cultural Revolution. That we need to learn those lessons. Yes, you have a right to make those mistakes, but within parameters. What you don't have the right to do is to repeat mistakes that lead to the destructions of millions of people. That's not legitimate for any generation. And that's the battle. It is not right to repeat the progressives, not young people, progressives repeating the mistakes of the 20s and 30s or the 60s and 70s again in 2010. Our job is to learn from historical struggles. And so on violence, I'm very clear about it. I make it a very powerful argument that violence is not acceptable. Now, let me just answer two final questions. The one is on the academics. Yes, I've seen the academic critics. You know, I went through an enormous amount of thinking around when I will name and when I won't. And there's an entire paragraph or two that's dedicated to under what conditions I will name or what. Remember, this book is a memoir. It is a story. For every single line in it, I stand by it. And I stand and I ask any of the individuals to challenge me on the actual facts. Because I am telling you, on every single one of these incidents I mentioned, I stand by it and I will call it out. I've had people who've called me a fascist thug, a neoliberal, and then they cry when I respond by saying, actually you're part of the Pol Pot brigade. Why is it legitimate for you to insult me every single day and then say when I respond, it is unacceptable? Here's the other thing about power. I have cases of individuals who've actually said all of the things. Not a single person has ever been charged at WITS for ever using any of the labels or insulting me or any of those things. So you say I have power? I've never deployed that power against somebody who had an alternative view or who have labeled me. But a memoir is a memoir. It is the other critique that was mentioned in the book about that article is the book is about you. Well, that is what memoirs are. They are about your thoughts on an issue. Otherwise, they're not memoirs. And I wrote a memoir. I didn't write an academic text because I didn't think I was in a position to do so. I cannot write one because I was a participant. So the book we wrote was a memoir about my thinking, why we made the decisions. Here's the final thing. And I know you're not going to like this. And forgive me for saying this. When we called in the police in 2016, we had 17 attempts at blowing up buildings. Frankly, I'll be honest with you, and I said this the other day, and people didn't like it. That if people are violent and threaten to burn down our institutions, I'll stand up and stop it. If I have to call in the police, so be it. Because frankly, nobody has the right to compromise the future of generations by destroying our public institutions. Nobody. And frankly, when you speak about violence, in 1986, I was there. I was in prison in that period. You know what's the important thing? We fought apartheid, but we have a democracy now. And for all of its failures, you have not seen the might of the apartheid state against protests. Yes, there have been individuals that have been harmed. But you know what? Frankly, what happened in 76 and 86 is not what happened in the 90s. The day I did this, why do we pay? Frankly, I would love not to pay. I have repeatedly said to the SRC, in 3 years going, I'll take this entire 40 million dedicated. 40 million, by the way, dedicated to security. And I'll put it into funding students completely. Give me a commitment that you will not engage in violence. And if anybody engages in violence, we can collectively expel. Every single time I've offered it, the student leadership have said no. If you I said I'll put the entire security budget into supporting and financing students. And every single time, student leadership said no. There is a romanticization about violence in our society. It's very, very dangerous. And frankly, if we want to have an inclusive future, I think we collectively need to be honest about our complacency about violence in our movements. Thank you very, very much.
Adam, thank you so much for your time, for your insights and perspectives, and sharing your reflections on Fees Must Fall and the narratives which have subsequently built. We have to let Adam go. I did say he had to leave.
I have to go to a memorial.
He's going to a memorial. So, Adam, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. I'm round of applause for his time.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Thank you so much. Thanks.
I don't know if the two of you would like to continue the discussion or respond to some of the questions were put, which primarily were directed to Adam, but I think we'd appreciate your responses as well. Wandile, I'll start with you. And then we'll wrap it up with a poem.
It's a shame that he's gone. I wanted to.
Yes, it is indeed.
to respond to just one issue, and this is an issue, I guess, that speaks to the intergenerational complications that South Africa has, intergenerational traumas that we share. And as he says now, he's justifying, I guess, his views about violence on the fact that it's a democracy, and we never really lived in apartheid, and so we don't have any rights to ever respond in any sort of violence. So I guess this idea with our elders, it's not just people in power, elders at home, family and everyone. We have this idea that we are always asking for too much as young people in South Africa, and I guess we are not communicating. We are not even communicating what we are asking for properly. There are certain ways in which we need to communicate, and we are policed in how we communicate, how we protest, and how we imagine even the political structure. I mean, how the growth of certain political parties in the country is in fact labeled being uninformed. When in fact, actually, while speaking about elections, you know how white people in this country always have this idea that people who vote for a certain party are uneducated. I've just done research that suggests that the people who actually vote, who actually vote blindly are people in urban areas, and those urban areas are white. The very rich areas are the ones and people in the township actually are the ones that vote differently, and that's an interesting thing. One thing also, if you've read Adam's book, you'll realize that Adam credits himself for the success of this sport. If you've seen, actually, you don't even have to have read. If you've seen the Had the Side documentary, he says, there's a point there, he says arrogantly and laughingly that, it was him, he went, as now we just said also, he had met the president, he's written letters on behalf of other vice chancellors, so he genuinely believes that the successes of Peace Must Fall are because he was part of this movement and because he was writing letters to the president. When in fact, when students refused to go meet the president at a certain point in time because it was a multi-political, I guess, organization, and we wanted them, it needed to be in consultation with everyone, and because we understood what power means as well when individual students are sitting with the president and are forced to make certain concessions. He goes in there blindly. He comes out with the only thing 0% increment and pushes nothing else, and he credits that to himself. When if students were there, we would have pushed it further if it was more democratic and not as elitist. And I guess it's because he believes himself to be at the center, and it says a lot about their leadership abilities and why their political affiliations are, or at least the thinking around how they were going to respond to the protests was. To prove this, so Adam is dishonest when you're sitting here. So he says, he speaks about a point about how quality education is to be maintained, and at a point in time he was proving that having black faces does not mean lower quality of education. He actually, one of his critiques of his Must Fall is that quality academics left the institution, which is incorrect. In fact, the academics that have left are academics that were the lecturers that were targeted, the ones he calls here, I guess, Marx, what is it? And extreme left and Marxist. Yes. So those are the ones that left. It's not actually at all true that the Fees Must Fall one of the results of this must follow is that quality academics have gone international now. There's no such thing. They actually they didn't go international. They just changed. It's a normal, I guess, cycle of life. You know, move from there to go lecture at Stellenbosch. That's what happened. No quality lecturers left the university. Yeah, lovely.
Lovely. Let's wrap it up. Let's give you the final word, and then we will call on Kanyisile Mboya for that recitation.
Cool. Okay, so yeah, I mean, again, I think it's difficult to respond to some of the things Prof said in his absence. But so what I will say, and just to be clear, I think you know, every time we talk violence, you know, immediately it's a legitimate, it's being positioned as we're legitimizing violence or romanticizing violence, which for me is actually a very stressful idea, that we're romanticizing violence. I'm not aware of any student that I had engaged with, given I was in the Western Cape when it happened, but I'm not aware of any student who romanticized violence. And I'm, as I've said, you know, I myself am not somebody who, you know, condones violence, but, you know, to talk about individual acts of violence as if they are separate from structural violence is also very dishonest. And so if I think about the individual acts of violence I've experienced in my own personal life, I can trace all of them back, whether it is poverty within Black communities, whether it is the emasculation of Black men that has led to them behaving and performing a hypermasculinity that lands on the bodies of Black women, whether it is you know, all the other additional violences of the system that have resulted in individual acts of violence landing on my body, and I'm sure the bodies of many other people in this room. So I think it's a bit dishonest to talk about individual acts of violence as if they're separate from structural violence and as if students are condoning individual acts of violence. I don't think that that's at all what the conversation is about. I think the broader question for me is to say that as a society, if we want to talk about violence, we cannot pin violence on the spectacular moments of violence that play out. We've got to talk about how do we get to acts of violence that seem so spectacular in a society where violence is so normal and where violence against specific bodies is so normal, that we don't think that, you know, we are here in Houghton and just down the road, if we head towards Alex, that we don't think that there's a violence just in the daily movement from there to here, right? That for me says something about how warped our understanding of violence is, and it is part of this you know, colonial legacy of how we understand violence, that violence is something that is done by people who are responding to violence, and not that violence is something, you know, that actually is deeply embedded in a system that's designed to oppress people and keep them in certain situations. I just want to respond to, I think it was Andy. So you said something about the question of education and how you know, what we may have missed in the broader conversation about fees must fall was situating it in a higher education context. And I think it is something that's worth discussing because, at least for me, again, it's something I grapple with because, you know, I have two perspectives on it. So the one perspective is to say that I don't think that, so fees must fall took place at institutions of higher education. But I don't think that Fees Must Fall was articulating only a vision for institutions of higher education. I think that Fees Must Fall was about a broader conversation about access within the space of education. It happened to be that it was students at universities that were carrying it out. So I recall, for example, helping some of my fellow students who prepared for the, there was a, what's his name? Fees Commission. There was some judge that was the head of the inquiry. I can't remember his name, but I do remember that as some of the SRC students were preparing, as some of the students from different campuses were preparing their submissions to go to that fees commission meeting or fees inquiry meeting, that a lot of us actually sat and prepared documents that covered everything from ECD right up, so early childhood development, right up to tertiary, including TVETs, including various other sites of education in the country. So in terms of the submissions that were being made, the submissions did cover a broader vision and a broader understanding of what education could be and what it could look like in our context. Because also early childhood development, if you really want to send your child to a decent creche, is unaffordable if you're on a basic salary in this country. So there were submissions being made about that, but again, they didn't take center stage in the broader narrative about it. Then on the other hand, for me, my other challenge was when I did hear this critique, and maybe it was just the ears I was listening with because of my positionality, when I did hear this critique about, but what about this, what about that, it often landed as like, oh, why are the students protesting about education? Why aren't you talking about corruption? Or why aren't you talking about hospitals? Or why aren't you talking about this, right? And so I think, and that's why I'm saying I've got two answers, because it's my contradiction that I'm dealing with, because on the other end, I felt like people were wanting, suddenly the students must address all the social issues, Suddenly we must fight for everything, and yet we picked the thing we wanted to fight for and wanted to use that as an opportunity to articulate a vision for society and let everybody fill in the gaps that were of relevance for them. So I think even, and this is again the sort of disservice that was done, through various media platforms, the fact that, even though Fees Must Fall was a general broad struggle across campuses, each campus had a very different flavor to how their movement played out. So, for example, TVETs had very specific requests that they were making around funding within the vocational, educational and training space. Universities had different things, your colleges had different things. So I think that's something we need to be aware of. And then just the last thing, then I'll be done. So I also just want to address the question of power and how we understand power. So for me, again, unfortunately, Prof. Habib is not here to defend himself. I struggle with the notion of like, oh, I'm in a position of power, but I never use my power to, squish people who spoke against me, or I never use my power to hurt other people, but other people can say ugly things about me. Yes, that's the nature of being in a position of power. I mean, surely the logic is not that when you're in a position of power, you should be able to just do whatever you want with that power. So again, for me, it's disappointing that at that level of academic achievement, that's how one would reason. But I think a bigger question that I want to address is this question of confronting power. And I'll say this very honestly. In hindsight, if I think about the amount of trauma that we experienced, right? So it's, if I think about what happened to so many students, the amount of suicides we've had since Fees Must Fall, the way in which private security, campus security, police officers raided our residences, attacked us just in jail, seeing you on the street. I remember in Stellenbosch that one particular day, I had to walk around with 3 random white boys I didn't even know, just because I knew that if I was walking around by myself and the police found me, I was going to be attacked. And I hadn't even done anything of great or profound violent interest, right, in that context. But I had to find random white people to walk around with during Fees Must Fall as a way of protecting myself, because of how easy it was for private security. Once they knew your faces, once the police knew who the people were in the protest, they would find ways to attack you and find ways to harm you. But back to my point, so if I think about what had happened to so many students post Fees Must Fall and even during Fees Must Fall, I think that one thing I definitely would not have done, I would have not encouraged us to engage power in the way that we engaged it during Fees Must Fall, right? So it's easy to talk about mass protest and mobilizing but I think in this context, in this version of South Africa, the way in which that kind of violence lands on your bodies and the way in which you've just got to navigate and be normal and move around after that, I don't think that it's worth the cost that it comes at. Especially if we acknowledge the fact that the majority of the students that were protesting were ordinary black students who needed to graduate, who had student debts that they needed to pay off, who had to start working so they could send money home so that their younger siblings could get onto campus and you know, and do what you need to do to get your family moving forward. And so for me, I think that in many ways, I think I might be wrong, but I think we underestimated the way in which the machinery of state violence would have been mobilized against us. I think we underestimated how quickly, how violently, and how glibly power was going to respond to us. And so I think we could have maybe thought about different ways, you know, of engaging that were not just about protests and bodies physically in the street. And I think that gained us something to a point. But if I think about some of my own friends that are sitting in mental institutions right now, if I think about some of my own friends who have not graduated, if I think about some of my friends who are sitting with debt and just like have no idea what's going to happen, for me it's like I'm not sure that it was worth it, because this collateral damage that he's talking about, oh, no one has the right to destroy institutions for multiple generations. As our institutions are now, they are destroying the future of multiple generations. They are destructive in their current form. And so, you know, for me, I think that there is a conversation to be had about what it means to confront power, especially when that power is being dispensed by bodies that look like you and by people who claim to be your parents in the struggle.
And Wandile, thank you so much for your insights and sharing your perspectives with us this afternoon. And your contributions have been immensely useful and will continue to do so, whether in the written form as they are here or in verbal engagements of this nature, to help us make sense of that moment, to help us make meaning of South Africa in the past and the present and the future. And we are hoping that these varied accounts, whether we agree with them or not, add to our understanding. Future generations can deduce for themselves what they take out, draw their own conclusions, what they think the truth was. But we are grateful to you for putting it down on paper, in writing. This archive is incredibly important in making memory, in making meaning, and so that hopefully we do not make the same kinds of mistakes in South Africa in the future, that we do make our society a more equal one, where young people do not feel alienated from the institutions where they study, and that these legacy problems, which continue to haunt us in South Africa, we start finding meaningful and lasting solutions for them. And this has been a very useful contribution. And we salute, of course, your courage in having been involved in those protests. Thank you so much. And thank you so much to our panelists, Adam as well, who's there, and to your participation this afternoon. We're going to wrap it up, as I said, with a rendition of a poem by Kanyisile Mboya. Kanyisile, if you could please come forward. Thank you.
Still hungry. We were fed, but we were not full. For there is no worse kind of poverty than the one that minimizes the portion each time. Each portion of your history, each portion of your language, each portion of your humanity. We are no longer frustrated by the constipation of our humanity because we have eaten, but still we produce no stools. And so like fools, we are told to wander around the untimely aporia of our stools, with burning ulcers born from sitting still. But we were born free, and so we ate, but we were never full. They named us greedy, entitled, and lazy, but took no notice of our surnames. Because greedy was the hungry child of Umsindo. Now with a real hunger, a hunger to burn down every single word which had caused them to be malnourished. Entitled was the child of Babala. Lazy was the child of Osipogazi, whose potential was an unfulfilled promise, whose gifts were amputated by false hope. But as a girl child, it was demanded of her, and there was the final child, who they thought did not even deserve a name. The child of Unomalanga, who awakened in her hungry siblings. The sun rising, a beam never fading, a wokeness never sleeping, an insomniatic consciousness. These children are still hungry, but are fueled by a petrol that death cannot stop from spreading, are lit by a tire that will never burn out, even around a human body, whose words continuously accumulate, so that even the mute will be able to articulate. Bahleli bonke etilongweni, bahleli bonke kwanongoma, yo Solomon. From Cape to Cairo, from Morocco to Madagascar, Iazania lilizele tu gogo gogo livukile ilozi labantu abatsha ingqengqele liyakhwaza uba izinyanya mazivuke kuyatsha. This is their food, and they will be fed. These children are still hungry.
Africa, Malupaganisu, Pondolwayo, Awizwa imithandazo, so yetu, awusibe moya munye, sibe moya, awunoma sekunzima, emhlabeni sihlukunyezwa, kabuhlungu, awunkosi sipha amandla, awusipha amandla wokunqoba, awusilwe nosathane, silwe nosathane.